Hi, my name is Dr. Rona Cran. I'm a senior lecturer in 20th century American literature, and my scholarship centres on the literature and culture of New York City, queer writing and modern American poetry. And I'm going to talk today about some research that I've been doing for my new book, Everyday Rebellion, which explores the relationship between poetry and strategies of resistance in New York City from the counterculture of the 1960s through to the HIV/AIDS crisis of the 1990s, well, 1980s and 1990s. And today I want to ask, how does a culture record and remember its experiences? How does a culture bear witness to tragedy? How do we speak to the unspeakable? And what are the particular responsibilities and possibilities of language in doing so? How does or how can a poem, a text, bear that weight? And specifically, I want to consider the role of the poet in a pandemic, focusing on the HIV/AIDS crisis as it unfolded in New York City during the 1980s. In their writing, New York City poets engaged in complex and varied processes of revising, renegotiating, imagining, and making meaning out of narratives of HIV/AIDS, asking pressing questions about disability, racism, gendered injustice, survival, death, and love in the context of a pandemic. Questions that echo meaningfully in our own present moment, but that I'm going to allow simply to echo rather than to overly labour. From angrily legible accounts of personal experiences to quieter, more oblique representations of the complexities of enduring, surviving, and articulating what poet John Ashbery gestures to as the unreconstructed story of AIDS, the poetry that emerged from a city in the grip of a decades-long tragedy reveals the gulf between the ideology surrounding the pandemic and the particular experiences of people living with and dying from HIV/AIDS. Such disclosures are couched in the intricate webs of language that make our universe knowable and habitable, even when it isn't, revealing articulation to be a crucial part of survival and remembrance. Critics have long recognized that AIDS elicited a crisis of language, a crisis of signifying. In Paula Treichler's words, AIDS wrought an epidemic of signification, which demanded vigilant attention to the discursive framing of the crisis. As Susan Sontag wrote in her book-length essay, AIDS and Its Metaphors, the pandemic engendered and was also fueled by the struggle for rhetorical ownership of the illness. Or, as queer theorist Lee Edelman puts it, politics and AIDS cannot be disentangled from their implication in the linguistic or the rhetorical. So in reading and discussing the poetry of this pandemic, it's important to keep in mind this idea of a crisis of articulation, as we in turn pay vigilant attention to the ways in which our poets frame, examine, articulate, and remember. So I'll start with some context. 40 years ago this month, on the 5th of June 1981, the first 5 cases of what later became known as AIDS were officially reported in the United States. Initially affecting primarily young gay men, first scores, then hundreds, then thousands of people began to experience and die from inexplicable illnesses, including rare skin cancer, pneumonia, blindness, and dementia. Here was a plague. 10 years later, over 100,000 Americans were dead, almost double the number of Americans that had been killed during the Vietnamese War. By 2018, 700,000 Americans had died. And today, even with the invention of an antiretroviral and prophylactic medication, which has greatly stemmed the progress of the pandemic and rendered infection with HIV chronic rather than necessarily fatal, providing you can access the drugs, the known global death toll from AIDS currently stands at 34.7 million people. My focus in this talk is on New York City during the 1980s and 1990s, partly because this is the area of my research, but also because it's the city that was most affected by AIDS, more affected than any other US city, partly due to its large gay and of-colour communities and its high proportion of IV drug users and sex workers, groups disproportionately vulnerable to infection from the virus, and partly due to the withholding of government funding from groups associated with the disease who were kind of not considered to be part of the so-called general population. The interaction of AIDS with other crises, such as poverty, homelessness, lack of healthcare, racism, and sexism, was long downplayed. By the 1980s, the late 1980s, the leading cause of death for New Yorkers aged 25 to 44 was HIV/AIDS. The city had a quarter of the nation's cases. At one point, it had 42% of the national caseload. Since the pandemic began in 1981 up to 2019, when official data was last published, New York City has lost over 116,000 people to AIDS-related deaths, whilst tens of thousands of children in the city have lost parents to the virus. And yet knowledge and understanding of this pandemic, this is the ensuing global pandemic, remain to a large extent shrouded in the fear, homophobia, and willed ignorance that allowed it to escalate to such devastating proportions in the first place. It took President Ronald Reagan 6 years and 28,000 deaths before he even mentioned the crisis in public. Politicians and clergymen welcomed the virus as proof of God's will to punish so-called transgression. Doctors refused sick people medical care. Commentators called for people with HIV to be tattooed and interned. And families of those who died, as writer, filmmaker, and activist David France puts it, withheld all but a shiver of grief. New York writer and activist Sarah Schulman describes AIDS in America as a mammoth act of self-deception with hundreds of thousands of deaths pretended away. She also notes that it's hard to have collective memory when so many who were there are not here to say what happened. Accompanying the unfolding of the HIV/AIDS crisis came an epidemic of misinformation, confusion, anger, superstition, and fear, compounded by the virus's time lag, the presentation of symptoms occurring months or even years after infection, compounded too by the unimaginable danger posed by something invisible and by the virulent homophobia that characterized American societal responses and, of course, governmental responses to the crisis. The widespread refusal or inability to engage with HIV as an indiscriminate infection that had no moral code or sexual orientation greatly impeded the search to understand and treat the illnesses that the virus caused and to halt the pandemic. As writer Andrew Holleran recalls, no one could see the way out. Everybody was afraid. Singer and activist Mike Callan, who died from AIDS in 1993, summed up the condition in his view of the average gay man in America during the 1980s: sick, shunned, frightened and frightening, and largely unprotected, either by law or by popular opinion. Artist and activist David Wojnarowicz, who died in 1992 and who wrote electrifyingly about his experiences of the illness, wrote, "When I was told that I'd contracted this virus, it didn't take me long to realize that I'd contracted a diseased society as well." So how does a culture respond to, record, and remember an experience such as this? A massacre that poet Pamela Sneed, in her recent book Funeral Diva, reads alongside the LA riots, Hurricanes Maria and Katrina, the 2010 earthquake in Haiti, and the Holocaust. A historical phenomenon and long drawn-out moment of rupture that poet June Jordan also frames in the context of other contemporary crises, including the deadly 1986 mudslides in Jamaica and killings by the KKK. A medical and political emergency, in Lee Edelman's words, characterized by terrifying epistemological ambiguity. A bomb, as Andrew Holleran writes, that fell without anyone's knowing the bomb had fallen. A disease, as French writer Hervé Gibert, who died aged 36 in 1991, puts it, that gave death time to live and its victims time to die, time to discover time, and in the end to discover life. A mass death event that left hundreds of thousands of survivors with depression and PTSD, with unprocessed grief and survivors' guilt, and with an overwhelming sense of having been abandoned. In particular, what can or does poetry do in such a crisis? What can it do that other forms of literature and culture, novels, films, works of art, can't? What is it about this particular form that speaks so aptly to the complexities of life and death? As Pamela Sneed writes, when Obama entered office, he carried a book of poetry by Derek Walcott. He wanted the world to see poetry's importance. Writer and activist Audre Lorde called poetry the skeleton architecture of our lives, emphasizing that as a mode of writing and perception, it is predicated on feeling. I feel, she wrote, therefore I can be free. Lorde also pointed out that poetry tends to be short. It is therefore quicker and cheaper to write, to read, and to publish. And in the context of a fatal illness, in which time is of the essence, poetry's brevity matters. Poetry also lends itself to performance, to communal exchange in a group setting, enabling connection and communication between people who might otherwise have had no connection at all. And where novels tend to have an inevitable trajectory, a plot with a beginning, a middle, and an ending, usually in the case of most, though not all, novels about AIDS, moving from health via sickness to death, poetry contains multitudes, to borrow from Walt Whitman. It offers multiple interpretations, multiple possibilities, multiple perspectives, positions, and orientations. It contains all paradoxes in its generative ambiguity. Poetry speaks differently. As poet Jay Bernard writes in their recently published manifesto, a poet can't deliver justice, but they can ask a different kind of question. By writing about it, I can help shape history, contribute to the effort of keeping it alive. Bernard also quotes writer David Mura to ask, what does it mean when poets surrender vast realms of experience to journalists, to political scientists, economists? What does it mean when we allow the objectivity of these disciplines to be the sole voice which speaks on events and topics of relevance to us all? And here, Mura echoes Allen Ginsberg, who described poetry as being like a radio that can broadcast continuously for thousands of years. It is not nothing. Poems can witness, interrogate, explore, argue, memorialize, hold to account, soothe, and even save lives. Poems from AIDS-era New York articulate the refusal of erasure. In forming counter-narratives, they are an alternate form of documentary, a documentary of the lives and deaths of individuals and communities, writing back, writing against, writing for, a written record that is communicated into print from which there is no escape. It is what Melvin Dixon, who died in 1992, called textual survival, working to enact futurity in the face of physical and cultural obliteration. As poet Eileen Myles says, how could you watch so many people die and not write about it? I've always thought of AIDS as the Vietnam of my generation. A war needs its poets, and we were absolutely there. For doctor and poet Rafael Campo, poetry is, and I quote, a physical process, is bodily exercise. Rhymes become the mental resting places in the ascending rhythmic stairway of memory. The poem, perhaps, is an idealization or a dream of the physical, the imagined healthy form, yet it does not renounce illness, rather it reinterprets it as the beginning point for healing. And the poet Mark Doty, who has also written beautifully about the AIDS crisis in both prose and poetry. He reflected in correspondence with scholar Deborah Landau on lines from a poem by American modernist William Carlos Williams. "It is difficult to get the news from poems, yet men die miserably every day for lack of what is found there." Commenting on these lines, Doty affirms the relevance of Williams's words, writing to Landau, "I believe that what is found there might alleviate misery, if not postpone death. If what is found there might help us all to reimagine the disease and rewrite the repetitive texts of homophobia and fear of otherness, then in fact, poetry might keep people from dying." So with this in mind, I'd like to take a look at some examples. I've chosen 3 poems by 3 different poets in order to offer some sense of the scope of poetry that was being written in and about New York during the 1980s, because it would be impossible in a single lecture to do justice to the wealth of poetry that has been written about the multiplicity of experiences of living with HIV/AIDS. I've chosen to focus on writing by queer men. Each of these poems by Robert Vasquez Pacheco, Melvin Dixon, and John Ashbery suggests that the HIV/AIDS crisis was experienced in different but nonetheless intersecting ways by queer men, and that poetry has a crucial role to play in making meaning out of what feels like something senseless, accidental, and capricious. Significantly, none of the poems names the virus or the syndrome that it causes directly. I'll read each poem aloud so that you can hear them for yourselves and think about them, and then I'll briefly offer a discussion about each one. So first, a poem called Necropolis by Robert Vasquez Pacheco. He's a writer, an artist, and an AIDS activist from the South Bronx who lost his partner to HIV/AIDS in 1986 and who contracted the virus himself but who survived. Of his activism, he has said, "I work in AIDS because I believe in social change. I believe that a real cure for AIDS involves addressing the problems exacerbated by the pandemic: homophobia, racism, sexism, classism. The cure I want is more than just a vaccine. The cure I want is human liberation." This poem was published in 1993 in a volume called Sojourner: Black Gay Voices in the Age of AIDS. The title is Necropolis. A necropolis is a cemetery, but the word literally means city of the dead. Necropolis. "My life is populated with the dead. Joe. They follow me down streets. Jeff. Huddle round me in elevators. Alan. Sit behind me in movies. Stuart. Or next to me in cabs. Daniel. Spiritment. Unquiet souls. Larry. They clamour for attention. Vito. Demanding remembrance. Ray. New York necropolis. Anthony. Monuments to dead times. Robert. And dead men. Darnell. I move through their city. Don. Their voices whispering. Warren. Remember, remember, remember. Jose. Remember fucking in that alley. Tate. Remember those guys at that party. Dennis. Remember, that's my album, bitch. Tommy. Remember how you cried when I dumped you. Todd. Remember how you cried at my funeral. Phil. They clutch and murmur. Joe. Please don't forget. Jeff. And with each death, Philip. I feel my past diminish. Kevin. Like the man in the horror film. Mark. I feel myself fading. Dave. Growing lighter, more transparent. Larry. Until one day, Marcus, Miguel, Scott. This is a list poem. It subverts, in some ways, the excitement of the restless sensations of the urban metropolis, the kind of writing you might find in the work of Frank O'Hara or Allen Ginsberg, where talk is the through line, the breathless narration of the New York pace of life. Only here the list is mirrored and interrupted by another list, a list of the names of the dead, the ghosts desperate not to be forgotten, the poet desperate not to forget, and this evokes one of the primary diseases associated with AIDS, even in very young people, dementia. This poem resists forgetting. Remember, 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 laying the names in their associated places onto the paper, keeping the bodies behind the words firmly in mind, registering the multitude and refusing to allow the imaginative slippage that occurs when a symbolic figure is allowed to stand in for the plurality of loss, the mere numbers that we ourselves have become so unsettlingly familiar with during the course of this most recent pandemic. This is a poem about being haunted, about haunting, about what Andrew Holleran referred to as the smaller city that haunts the mind as a sort of doppelganger. There are many corners, doorways, buildings in New York now that memorialize people without an official designation. It's about the disappearance of people and experiences, about the loneliness caused by the virus, and about the negation in the face of loss, of the pleasures of nostalgia, of the pleasures of remembering. This next poem is called One by One by Melvin Dixon, a black scholar, novelist, and poet who taught at Wesleyan University, the City University of New York, Fordham University, and Columbia University, and who died from HIV/AIDS in 1992. This poem was published in 1989 in the anthology Poets for Life, 76 Poets Respond to AIDS. One by one. They won't go when I go, Stevie Wonder. Live bravely in the hurt of light, CHR. The children in the life, another telephone call, another man gone. How many pages are left in my diary? Do I have enough pencils, enough ink? I count on my fingers and toes the past kisses, the incubating years, the months ahead. Thousands, many thousands gone. I have no use for numbers beyond this one man, one face, one torso, curled into mine for the ease of sleep. We love without mercy, we live bravely in the light. Thousands, many thousands. Child, I knew he was funny. One of the children, a member of the church, a friend of Dorothy's. He knew the Websters pretty well too. Girlfriend, he was real. Remember we used to sit up in my house, pouring tea, dropping beads, dishing this one and that one. You got any T cells left? The singularity of death, the mourning thousands. It begins with one and grows by one, and one and one and one, until there's no one left to count. So this poem, like the work of June Jordan and Pamela Sneed, thinks about AIDS both contextually and intertextually. And I'll talk about the kind of intertexts. The poem is prefaced with two epigraphs, one by Stevie Wonder and one by a scholar called Charles Henry Roll, who was an editor and lifelong champion of black writing, including Dixon's. The speaker's anxiety about the future, about time, about writing, and about love in the face of a fatal illness. How many pages are left in my diary? Do I have enough pencils? Do I have enough ink? I count on my fingers and toes the past kisses, the incubating years, the months ahead. This is interrupted, this anxiety, by the lines, thousands, many thousands gone. And these lines evoke two key American intertexts. So firstly, an essay by the iconic writer and activist James Baldwin called Many Thousands Gone, an essay in which he reflects on the ways in which history and myth inflect what it means to be black in America, and how storytelling is crucial to identity. And secondly, the lines refer, as does Baldwin's essay, to a spiritual sung during slavery times, but particularly during the Civil War era, as enslaved people fled plantations and reflected on the devastations of the past and the hopes of the future. In the final stanza, Dixon juxtaposes the singularity of death with the mounting thousands, a number that grows by one and one and one and one, until there's no one left to count. So there's individuality within the multitudes, he suggests, as Baldwin knew, as the singers of the spiritual knew. in making contact through his poetry with the history of Black lives and deaths in America and with the literature and culture created during those lives, from the spirituals to Stevie Wonder, Dixon aligns himself with them, with their joy, their fellowship, and their suffering. And he enacts a kind of remembering that looks to the past and looks to the future, that will outlast the singularity of his own death. The final poem that I'm going to read is by John Ashbery, taken from his 1987 collection, April Galleons. Ashbery, who died in 2017 at the age of 90, had a really close and long-standing relationship, association with New York City. He was not only one of America's greatest poets, but he was one of the first-generation New York school. April Galleons, as a collection, is a sustained response to AIDS. It refutes the time-honored but chilling equation of sex and death during the period. It's a long collection and it was really hard to choose a poem, so I've just gone with the one that opens the collection, which is called Vetiver. Vetiver. Ages passed slowly, like a load of hay, as the flowers recited their lines and pike stirred at the bottom of the pond. The pen was cool to the touch. The staircase swept upward through fragmented garlands, keeping the melancholy already distilled in letters of the alphabet. It would be time for winter now, its spun sugar palaces and also lines of care at the mouth, pink smudges on the forehead and cheeks, the colour once known as ashes of roses. How many snakes and lizards shed their skin for time to be passing on like this, sinking deeper in the sand as it wound toward the conclusion? It had all been working so well, and now, well, it just kind of came apart in the hand, as a change is voiced, sharp as a fishhook in the throat, and decorative tears flowed past us into a basin called infinity. There was no charge for anything. The gates had been left open intentionally. Don't follow, you can have whatever it is. And in some room, someone examines his youth, finds it dry and hollow, porous to the touch. Oh, keep me with you, unless the outdoors embraces both of us, unites us, unless the bird catchers put away their twigs, the fishermen haul in their empty, sleek nets, and others become part of the immense crowd around this bonfire, a situation that has come to mean us to us, and the crying in the leaves is saved, the last silver drops. So this is an oblique, ambiguous poem, and Ashbery does not offer readers an easily legible epiphany about his personal experiences. Rather, his poetry represents queerness through abstraction, predicated on slippages, imprints, impressions, and disruptions, and a refusal of the dominant metaphors for AIDS. This kind of experimental, unstable style suggests a convergence of anxiety and uncertainty, as well as a means for readers to understand histories of AIDS as unfinished, as enduring. His work is difficult, it is not easy, but as Samuel R. Delany suggests in The Tale of Plagues and Carnivals, also about the AIDS crisis, disease can be read as a kind of dis-ease, an unease, a non-easiness. And Ashbery enacts this in his work. He works to capture those things that are really difficult to articulate, and to emphasize the incoherence of feeling the inexorable sweeping forward away from life and into grief. Queer theorist Eve Kosofsky-Sedgwick speaks about the punishing stress of loss, incomplete mourning, chronic dread, and social fracture that AIDS wrought. And this is what Ashbery articulates in this poem. The majestic, garlanded, upward-sweeping staircase that appears in the first stanza, a metonym, if you like, for some kind of glorious future, is soon superseded by a sense of irreversible disintegration and disbelief. It had all been working so well, and now, well, it just kind of came apart in the hand, sharp as a fishhook in the throat. Time is presented as winding toward a conclusion, mired unalterably in sand. The gates, it is implied, of death have been left open intentionally. And there's a sense here of journalist Randy Schultz's view that AIDS did not just happen to America, it was allowed to happen. The poem ends with the image of the immense crowd around this bonfire. But in the line, a situation that has come to mean us to us, Ashbery's poem, like Dixon's, like Vasquez Pacheco's, can be read as an affirmation of personhood in the face of a mass death event. The immense crowd is made up of individuals, and intimacy here is suggested to take on new meanings when threatened by impermanence. So hopefully these brief readings and discussions have offered some sense of the ways in which New York's poets approached and articulated the crisis of HIV/AIDS. There's obviously much, much more to say about this, but for now I'd just like to finish by returning to Melvin Dixon, and to do that I want to quote from his last public speech, which he gave at the 1992 Outright Conference in Boston. "I come to you bearing witness to a broken heart," he said. "I come to you bearing witness to a broken body, but witness to an unbroken spirit. We must leave the legacy of our writing and our perspectives on gay and straight experiences. Our voice is our weapon. I may not be there for the development of gay literary history, but I'll be somewhere listening for my name. You, then, are charged by the possibility of your good health, by the broadness of your vision, to remember us."